I used to believe that as long as I never touched anyone else, I was still loyal. That belief made things easier. It gave me room to breathe inside a life that had slowly started to feel too tight. From the outside, everything looked fine. Stable. Predictable. Safe. That was the word everyone used, safe. And maybe that was the problem. We had been together long enough that silence no longer needed explaining. Mornings passed with routine efficiency. Nights ended with backs turned, not out of anger, just habit. I told myself this was what commitment looked like. I told myself that wanting more was childish, that longing was something you grew out of. Still, there were moments when I felt invisible in my own life, like I could disappear for hours and nothing would change, that he didn't arrive like a storm. There was no dramatic entrance, no instant spark I could point to and blame. He was just there. Consistent. Attentive. The kind of presence you don't notice at first because it feels familiar, almost harmless. Conversations with him didn't demand effort. They flowed in a way that reminded me of who I used to be before everything became so measured and careful. At first, it was nothing. That's what I told myself. Just talking. Just laughing a little more than usual. Just feeling understood in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I never crossed a line, not outwardly. I still went home. I still played my role. I still believed that intention mattered more than thoughts, but thoughts have weight. They linger. They follow you into quiet spaces. I'd catch myself replaying small moments, his tone when he said my name, the way he listened without waiting for his turn to speak. I hated how much those things stayed with me. I hated that I noticed the guilt didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces. A pause before answering a question. A hesitation when my phone lit up. A tightening in my chest when I realized I was editing myself, deciding what to share and what to keep just for me. That was new. Secrets didn't start as lies. They started as choices that I told myself I deserved to feel seen. I told myself everyone needed someone who noticed them. None of that meant I was doing anything wrong. Not yet. As long as I stayed aware, as long as I kept control, nothing could really happen. That was the logic I clung to, but awareness has a way of sharpening desire instead of dulling it. I became more conscious of him, of space and distance and timing. Of how close was too close. Of how long was too long. Every interaction felt like standing near an edge, convincing myself I was only looking down, not stepping forward. What scared me most wasn't how he looked at me. It was how I felt when he did. Calm. Warm. Awake. Feelings I hadn't realized I'd been missing until they were suddenly there, impossible to ignore. I started measuring my days by those moments, even as I pretended they didn't matter. At home, everything stayed the same. And that sameness began to feel louder. The contrast was unbearable at times. I would sit in familiar rooms, surrounded by a life I had chosen, and wonder when it had stopped feeling like mine. That question alone made me feel disloyal. That I knew better. I knew how these stories ended. I had judged people who let things go too far, who claimed they hadn't meant for it to happen. I promised myself I would never be one of them. I believed that knowing the danger was enough to avoid it, but knowing isn't the same as stopping. There was a moment, small, almost insignificant, when I realized something had shifted. Nothing dramatic happened. No touch. No confession. Just a feeling, heavy and undeniable, settling in my chest. The understanding that I was no longer just reacting. I was waiting. Waiting for moments with him. Waiting for the way I felt when he was near. That's when it hit me. The line I swore I'd never cross wasn't a single step. It was a slow drift. And without noticing when it began, I had already moved closer than I ever meant to. I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray anyone. That's the lie people tell themselves, and I was no different. It felt gradual, almost reasonable, the way things shifted from harmless to hidden. The change wasn't loud. It was quiet. Private. It lived in the spaces no one else could see. I started noticing how carefully I chose my words around him. How conversations that should have been casual carried weight. I paid attention to timing, to moments when no one else was around, to how easy it was to let minutes stretch longer than they should. I told myself it was coincidence. That I was reading too much into it. But I knew better. I always knew, what made it dangerous wasn't attraction. It was comfort. The kind that settles into your bones before you realize it doesn't belong there. He didn't push. He didn't cross lines for me. That part mattered more than I wanted to admit. It allowed me to pretend I was still in control. That this was mutual restraint, not temptation. That I began sharing things I hadn't said out loud in years. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. The kind of honesty that slips out when you feel safe. When you feel listened to. Each confession felt small on its own, but together they formed something intimate, something that belonged somewhere else. At home, I started holding back. Not intentionally at first. I was just tired of explaining myself. Tired of filling silence with words that went nowhere. I convinced myself it was normal to want privacy. Everyone keeps parts of themselves hidden, right? That didn't mean I was being unfaithful. It just meant I was human. Still, my body reacted before my mind caught up. A quickened breath when he stood close. A warmth that spread when our conversations dropped into silence instead of ending. Silence with him felt full. Silence at home felt empty. That contrast scared me more than anything else. That I hated how aware I was of him. Of the sound of his voice. Of the way my attention shifted the moment he entered a room. I tried to dull it. I told myself to focus on everything else. Responsibilities. Commitments. The life I had built. But desire doesn't disappear just because you refuse to name it. The first real secret wasn't a message or a moment. It was a feeling I chose not to share. The second came right after. Then another. Soon, I was managing two versions of myself without admitting that's what I was doing. One that stayed loyal in action, and one that drifted farther in thought. That I justified it easily. Nothing had happened. No one was being hurt. As long as I didn't cross a physical line, this was all just noise inside my head. Temporary. Harmless. That belief gave me permission to keep going, but there were moments when I caught myself hoping. Hoping for interruptions. For chance encounters. For excuses that didn't feel like lies. That's when I understood that I wasn't just responding anymore. I was anticipating. And anticipation changes everything. There was tension in that waiting. A pull I felt even when we weren't together. It followed me into quiet moments, into places where I should have felt grounded. I started wondering how close was too close, and why the answer kept shifting. That I could have stopped then. I know that now. There were still exits. Still room to step back and pretend this never became anything more than a passing feeling. But stopping would have meant admitting what it already was. And I wasn't ready to face that. The truth settled in slowly, like something heavy pressing against my chest. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was protecting the secret. Protecting the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. By the time I realized wanting had turned into something deliberate, it was already woven into me. I hadn't crossed the line yet. But I was standing so close to it that pretending otherwise felt like the biggest lie of all. I remember the exact second everything tipped, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing, of how fast your heart is moving, of how there's no one left to blame but yourself. I had crossed into a place where pretending was no longer possible. There was no rush of excitement like I'd imagined. No sudden clarity. What I felt instead was weight. Heavy and undeniable. The understanding that this wasn't happening to me, I was choosing it. That realization settled deep, cutting through every excuse I'd been holding onto that I told myself I could still stop. I told myself this was just a moment of weakness, that moments pass if you let them. But my body didn't listen to logic. My thoughts scattered, clashing with everything I believed about myself. Loyalty. Control. Integrity. All of it felt fragile, like it could crack under the pressure of a single decision. That he was close enough that I could sense him without looking. Presence does that, it announces itself without sound. I became painfully aware of how little space existed between us, how that distance had already been shrinking long before this moment. Nothing about it felt sudden anymore. It felt inevitable, and that scared me more than desire ever could. My mind raced ahead, playing out consequences I wasn't ready to face. Faces. Questions. Silence that would follow me everywhere. I thought about the life I'd built, the promises I'd made without ever imagining they'd be tested like this. I thought about how easy it would be to turn away and how hard it would be to live with the memory if I didn't. There was a split second where time seemed suspended. Where everything I was and everything I was about to become balanced on the same fragile edge. I waited for guilt to stop me. I waited for fear to win. Instead, I felt a strange calm, like something inside me had finally given up the fight. That surrender wasn't loud. It didn't feel reckless or wild. It felt deliberate. Quiet. Almost gentle. And that's what haunts me the most. I wasn't swept away. I stepped forward with open eyes. In that moment, I understood that crossing the line doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Like acceptance. Like allowing something you've been denying to finally take shape. The realization hit hard. Wanting had already changed me. This was just the confirmation that I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel powerful. I felt exposed, stripped of every excuse I'd used to protect myself from the truth. This wasn't about loneliness anymore. Or feeling unseen. This was about choosing to betray something solid for something uncertain and intoxicating. When it was over, there was no relief. Just a hollow space where certainty used to be. The silence returned, heavier than before, filled with everything I hadn't said and couldn't take back. I avoided thinking too far ahead because the future suddenly felt unstable, like one wrong step could collapse it entirely. I didn't regret it the way people expect you to regret things. Not immediately. What I felt was confusion. A tangled mix of guilt and longing, of shame and attachment. That combination scared me. Regret can be clean. This was messy. I realized then that I had changed the shape of my life without knowing what would replace it. There was no undoing what had happened, no version of the past where I could pretend this choice didn't exist. I had crossed into something permanent, even if no one else knew yet. The hardest part wasn't what I'd done. It was knowing I'd felt alive while doing it. That truth sat heavy in my chest, impossible to ignore. It forced me to question everything: what I wanted, what I deserved, and whether comfort was the same thing as love.As I stood there, surrounded by the aftermath of a decision I could never unmake. One thought repeated itself over and over: this moment would follow me. Into my silence. Into my relationship. Into every version of myself that came after. And no matter how carefully I tried to move forward, would never be able to say I didn't know what I was doing when I let everything change. Nothing around me looked different afterward, and that was the cruelest part. The world didn't react. The days didn't pause. Life kept moving as if I hadn't just split myself in two. I went back to my routines, answered the same questions, sat in the same rooms, and realized how easy it was to carry something this heavy without anyone noticing. At first, I thought distance would fix it. That if I returned fully to the life I'd chosen, the other part would fade on its own. But absence didn't erase what had happened. It sharpened it. Every quiet moment left space for memory to slip in, uninvited and persistent. I wasn't haunted by details. I was haunted by feeling. Guilt didn't arrive like punishment. It crept in slowly, disguising itself as distraction. I found myself drifting during conversations, answering without listening, reacting without being present. I started holding my breath without realizing it, as if staying still might keep the truth from spilling out. It didn't. At home, I noticed changes before anyone else did. I became careful in ways I never had been. Careful with my expressions. Careful with affection. I feared being seen too clearly, afraid that if someone looked long enough, they'd find the crack I was desperately trying to cover. That fear built walls where there hadn't been any before. I questioned everything. Not in dramatic ways, but in quiet, unsettling ones. Was I unhappy, or just restless? Had something been missing all along, or had I created the gap myself? I replayed the past, searching for a moment where things could have gone differently, knowing that even if I found it, it wouldn't change anything. What surprised me most was how the connection didn't disappear. It lingered without effort, without contact, without permission. It existed in contrast, against the life I returned to, against the version of myself I tried to reclaim. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. The presence was already there. I considered confession more times than I can count. Not because I believed it would fix anything, but because secrecy is exhausting. Carrying the truth alone felt heavier than facing the consequences. Still, every time I imagined speaking, I froze. Some truths don't just change the moment you say them. They rewrite everything that comes after. So I stayed silent. And silence became its own choice, one I had to live with daily. I learned how to exist between who I was and who I pretended to be. I learned how to smile without warmth, how to touch without fully arriving, how to promise things I wasn't sure I could keep anymore. There were moments when I hated myself for not feeling worse. For missing something I had no right to miss. That contradiction lived inside me, uncomfortable and unresolved. I understood then that regret doesn't always cancel desire. Sometimes they coexist, feeding off each other, leaving you trapped in between. I stopped asking whether what I did was right or wrong. That question had no answer that brought peace. What mattered was what I was willing to live with. What kind of person I would be moving forward. Whether I could continue building a life on top of something fractured. Time didn't heal it. It softened the edges, but the center remained intact. I carried it quietly, aware that every decision I made now was shaped by what I'd already done. There was no clean slate waiting for me. Just the responsibility of moving forward without pretending the past didn't exist. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if silence will eventually feel like peace or if truth will one day demand to be spoken. All I know is that one choice changed the way I see myself forever. And no matter how carefully I return to the life I had, there's a part of me that will always remember what it felt like to step beyond it and realize there was no way back.